Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Outsider Report with Irina Tsukerman on the Coalition Radio. Tonight we have a special guest, John Rossomando. He will speak about his new book, The Arab Spring Ruse: How the Muslim Brotherhood Duped Washington in Libya and Syria, published by the Center for Security Policy, where John works as a senior analyst. And before we get into this fascinating discussion, John, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you were drawn to this particular area.
Well, my background is an investigative journalist with over 20 years of experience. I initially got into the topic of Islamic extremism after 9/11 when I was sent by my then employer, CNNSnews.com, to the Old Town Islamic Bookstore in Alexandria, Virginia. And it turned out to be run by the Muslim Brotherhood. Abdurrahman al-Moody, he later went to prison as a with Al Qaeda fundraiser. Mohammed Amesh, who I talk about in my book, is another Muslim Brotherhood leader in the United States. And as I found more about them, about a decade or so later, I went to work for Steve Emerson at the Investigative Project on Terrorism, which is where this all started out. It started out as a look at the extremists the Obama administration was bringing to the White House and to the State Department. And then it evolved into a look as to why they were doing what they were doing, who they were meeting with, and how all these groups were interconnected.
What did you discover?
Well, I found that there was a coordinated effort by the Muslim Brotherhood, both in the United States and abroad. With focusing in Qatar and in Washington, that worked to get the Obama administration involved in Libya and Syria. And President Obama came out with his Cairo speech in June of 2009, where he promised a new beginning with the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood, a few months earlier, put together a letter in which they asked President Obama to endorse the plans for "quote unquote" democracy. They wanted the United States to, get out of Iraq, get out of fighting in Afghanistan and so forth, and to stop supporting the dictators that they or the authoritarian leaders in places like Egypt that we had been supporting.
But they were pushing for their own dictators. So where was the difference? Why did we have to follow their lead on these issues?
Well, it was just a matter that President Obama came from a very radical background. He was opposed to the idea of American hegemony and American exceptionalism, and he viewed the Muslim Brotherhood as victims, victims of American oppression and so forth. He threw away at least the public part of American foreign policy that had gone back decades. I mean, back in the Clinton administration, then National Security Advisor Anthony Lake gave a speech in 1994 where he opposed the idea of giving support to the Brotherhood because he said it would be a case of one election, one time. And as we've seen in Turkey, where the Brotherhood linked AKP under Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power about 20 years ago. They haven't gone anywhere, and they've worked to squelch power. So we saw the same thing happen here before in like the fall of 2010. President Obama's National Security Council, you had Ben Rhodes, Samantha Power, Michael McFaul, who also was responsible for the so-called Russia reset, put together a document called PSD 11, in which they advised the administration to support regime change and support the Islamists in places like Egypt, Libya, Syria, etc.
The Muslim Brotherhood has created and extended a global network of operations and shell organizations. What made you decide to focus specifically on Libya and Syria?
Well, because Libya and Syria have been the lasting impacts of the so-called Arab Spring, or really the Islamist Spring, is probably best known, because you still have civil wars going on there. The government of Libya under Gaddafi, it was an authoritarian, brutal regime, but at least it was relatively stable. Now it's sort of been like the Wild West, where you have Brotherhood and Al Qaeda linked militias fighting against kind of more authoritarian, kind of secular governments under General Haftar, and with the House of Representatives, which is more, I believe, is more democratic, and also in Syria. They put together networks in the United States, in both countries, to get the Obama administration involved. And in both countries, you had the Muslim Brotherhood, who were directly working with militias that were aligned with Al Qaeda.
So, in both Syria and Libya, we have also seen the Obama administration take a very confusing and confused multilateral position with being essentially nowhere and everywhere at the same time. In Syria, at one point, we had Pentagon-backed fighters fighting CIA-backed operatives. How did in Libya we also um, ended up arming the very militias that are causing problems today? What exactly was the vision of the administration that has led to these strange results?
Well, I don't think they really knew what the heck they were doing. I mean, they, at least in the State Department, they put the niece of the Muslim Brotherhood Prime Minister of Egypt, Hisham Kandil, his niece Khulud, in charge of outreach to the Syrian rebels. And she would go and tell her boss, Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Policy, Lawrence Silverman, that some people that they were bringing, this guy that they were bringing in, didn't support suicide bombing. So they had a very confusing, way. I don't think they knew exactly what one hand was doing with the other. I mean, for example, I found in Hillary's emails that both now National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and her longtime friend Sidney Blumenthal had informed her of the links between Al Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood and places around the region, and it's particularly in Libya during the February 2011 uprising.
So interestingly, you mentioned Hillary's email and Jake Sullivan, because last year a new trove of Hillary's emails was uncovered, cementing her apparent connections to Qatar, to Brotherhood, and to the events of the Arab Spring. Nevertheless, a campaign led by Qatari activists and by their proxies in the West um, has tried to kind of undermine the premise that Hillary had colluded in some ways with the officials regarding the events of the Arab Spring. Can you tell us a little bit about this contradiction? What exactly was her role with regard to that?
Well, she was the point person at the start of the Arab Spring, according to a European intelligence source I spoke with. The CIA got together with Qatari officials in the fall of 2010 to plot their move in Libya. They began the uprising in February of 2011, and then you had a group called the FIDH, which included Brotherhood members who had previously petitioned the Obama administration to bring about democracy. About they fabricated human rights things, saying that Gaddafi was bombing protesters when they really were rebels who were linked with Al Qaeda, who were involved in an uprising, and they went to the UN Human Rights Council, and the Human Rights Council took them at their word and ruled that Gaddafi was engaged in war crimes. As a result of that, Hillary went to the Obama administration and then to NATO and pressed for military action. And as a result of this chain of events that Qatar and the Obama administration through the CIA had put together, they began the offensive that brought down Gaddafi.
So we are seeing that, over 10 years ago still, Qatar was essentially driving US foreign policy, at least on some issues, and instigating events that led to protracted conflict, not so different from what we're seeing today with Afghanistan and some other places around the world. Why did anyone think that was a good idea? Why was the CIA listening to Qatar? What were they getting out of it?
Well, for all the only thing that I can think of is that Qatar had made itself invaluable to the West by providing the base at Al Udeid. So they just
But
seemed to look the other way.
the Abu Dhabi was such a big deal because at the time until 2012 the US is the US most of the what we're seeing at Abu Dhabi was still based in Saudi Arabia before we were asked to leave. So at that time that still wasn't the case. Qatar was not nearly as seemingly indispensable as it is now. So what was the interest of the agency in their support? Why did they think that Qatar would be in any way a positive influence or someone to take direction from?
Well, because probably because of Qatar's influence, with the Libyan Brotherhood. I mean, if you
Hmm.
look at Ali Salabi, who was Sheikh Harad Ali's man, he had been a prominent person in the Libyan Brotherhood, who was in exile in Libya at the time, and they were pushing for democracy and so forth. But according to Libyan intelligence documents and also other corroborating documents from the UAE, Mr. Salabi, and according to Jake Sullivan, was closely involved with Al Qaeda. So you have the Brotherhood Al Qaeda connection going on there. And we know going back several years earlier that the Qatari royal family was very supportive of Osama bin Laden and of Al Qaeda. I mean, it was an ongoing thing. I have a hard time understanding exactly why they were doing what they were doing, but we know that the agency and the Obama administration worked with Qatar to bring this chain of events about.
So the Qatari royal family was supportive of Al Qaeda. They were supportive of Osama bin Laden. They obviously had some connections to the terrorist organization which had attacked the U.S. on 9/11. Why do we not hear about any of this at all?
I think that's a mystery. I mean, I don't want to speculate because I don't have an answer there. But I think that there was the president of the United States wanted a shift of roles with the Muslim world, so he possibly thought that by shifting behind the Islamists that he could make the United States look like a good guy. Kind of there's a theory in academia that if you allow the Islamists into government, that they'll turn away from violence and from terrorism and so forth. And there were a lot of people like Quentin Wojtorowicz, who was part of Obama's National Security Council, who I actually spoke with as part of this project. They thought that they could engage the Qatari controlled International Union of Muslim Scholars and moderate it and possibly bring about an end to international jihadism, which was very naive and foolhardy. if you ask me.
And how were they planning on engaging with that body of scholars, which, by the way, at one point was headed by Yusuf Qaradawi, who infamously justified suicide bombing?
Well, they just thought that it's the same thing you had with China. They said that by trading with them and by talking with them, you'd make them more democratic. They thought that they could engage with the International Union of Muslim Scholars using Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, who was at the time Qaradawi's number two, who they thought was a moderate, to maybe temper some of their extremism and their support for terrorism down. I mean, the IUMS it was very involved in the so-called Arab Spring, both in Libya and Syria. It was kind of interesting because in February of 2011, Sheikh Qaradawi issued a fatwa calling for the killing of Gaddafi. Shortly thereafter, a guy by the name of Osama Amesh, who was an active Muslim Brotherhood activist at Darul Hijra Islamic Center outside of Washington, D.C., who was a major entry point with the Obama administration, chartered something called the Libyan Emergency Task Force to lobby for the ouster of Gaddafi here in Washington. So, about a month later, you had the same thing where the Syrian Emergency Task Force was founded by Brotherhood activists at Darul Hijra the day after Qaradawi called for the ouster of Assad.
The Benghazi committee that later studied the events that infamously transpired in Libya, a lot of people criticized them for never really getting to the meat of the matter, never really taking on head on the underlying mystery of why the Obama administration thought that Gaddafi, who had moderated his views, rejected the nuclear program following the ouster of Saddam Hussein, and was essentially being more cooperative. Why there was such urgency to intervene and to allow those events to transpire. In fact, it's unclear what exactly motivated the administration to push this agenda so hard that they then had to cover it up with the fake news, the early version of fake news about the supposed videos that allegedly insulted people and so forth. The committee really got kind of confused in questions about Hillary Clinton and her role, about this whether or not she was sleeping on the job or and so forth. But the real questions never were directly answered. What did you discover talking to people about those events? What did the administration really hope to achieve? Were they Did they not have any inkling of the type of chaos that might break out in a highly tribal country?
Well, I think that they naively believe that American or Western values could be transplanted in a place like Libya. They don't understand how the Middle East works. And I've talked with multiple people from multiple countries who say that the State Department people really don't have a clue what they're doing, who these people that they're dealing with are, and how the tribal dynamics work. Because I mean, they think that a nation state is a nation state. I mean, regardless of the fact that the Europeans just drew lines across the desert and said, this is Iraq, this is Syria, this is Libya, this is Egypt, etc. So they thought that they could bring about a quote unquote democracy, but they had no idea how they were going to accomplish it. And they put their hands behind people who just gave flowery speeches to them about how they would be democratic and and so forth. And the U.S. wouldn't be this evil imperialist country that everybody hated.
So they criticized the Bush administration for blundering into Iraq without really thinking through the long term repercussions of removing Saddam Hussein without finding an appropriate substitute or managing the sectarian issues in the country, and yet they went on to do exactly the same thing, if not possibly worse. How do you explain the fact that they did the exact same thing that they had criticized their predecessor for?
Well, it was the same sort of arrogance and ignorance. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Either they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. I mean, if you want to talk about Iraq, uh, Colin Powell, God bless his soul, told President Bush before the election that you break it, you buy it, because he saw what would happen, and he warned the president. But when they don't want to listen, you have these arrogant diplomats who think that they know everything. I mean, I'll take Michael McFaul for example, because I've dealt with him. He thinks he knows everything, and he was one of the authors of PSD 11. So they think that it's just like the Biden administration. If Trump did X, we're going to do Y, and we're going to pay attention to the lessons that were learned.
It's interesting because some of the the archives about Hillary Clinton's dealings with Qatar revealed that they offered to donate a significant sum of money in support of media operations that Hillary spearheaded in Egypt and other places that would sell the Muslim Brotherhood to the population. And in fact, they literally got behind the Muslim Brotherhood and promoted them above other more liberal factions that vied for power at the time. How do you explain the fact that not only did they back what they claimed to be a grassroots movement, which was not at all grassroots, it was highly organized and financed externally, but they were actively meddling in other countries' business, and they were actually acting in an anti-democratic way by supporting particular factions with a particular structure through external funding.
Well, their goal is, to bring about the Islamist, world state. I mean, that's sort of the Islamist view. And if you look in Libya, the group that pushed this idea that the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, not the Muslim Brotherhood, that Gaddafi was slaughtering his people indiscriminately, was heavily, Brotherhood influenced, and also heavily funded and controlled by Qatar, according to Ali Zaidan, who was the prime minister of the Transitional National Council, which was backed by Qatar, the EU, and the United States. He said it was basically a Muslim Brotherhood operation. He said that in Time magazine in 2012. So Qatar was looking to create sort of client states that could help it to, have an outsized influence. I mean, we've seen Qatar in building its sovereign wealth fund in places like the UK and the United States. Here in Washington D.C., Qatar's sovereign wealth fund owns $1 billion shopping center. So they're using their money and their influence to as a means for power.
So, this is something I don't understand. Several Muslim countries, all allies of the United States in various capacities, had warned the US against engaging in this type of politics. Egypt is a country of 100 million people, Saudi Arabia is a country of over 30 million people. Qatar is a tiny country, and yet you see that the US had appeared to be, and you yourself just mentioned its open support for Al Qaeda. US seems to have put all its eggs in the basket of Qatar. Why? What was the appeal to a country that is neither populous nor particularly democratic, nor particularly liberal, nor particularly friendly to the United States?
They have money. I mean, they,
So
money.
did some of the other countries in the region that were against the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar was not the only country with
Exactly.
money.
But, if you want to go back to the origins of this, after 9/11, Brookings set up, its global is Islamic meetings every year. So Qatar consciously worked to cultivate the support of think tanks like Brookings and other sort of mainstream sort of left to center think tanks starting after 9/11. I mean, you had people like Martin Indyk, who was the U.S. ambassador to Israel under Clinton. He was a big part of Qatar finding its way into Washington. So you had more and more of the think tank base in Washington becoming dependent on Qatari dollars and Qatari influence. So Qatar, unlike Saudi Arabia and the UAE, put a lot more emphasis on buying influence. So you had top level American representatives going to these meetings at the Brookings Doha Center every year. And by the time of the Arab Spring, they had reached critical mass in terms of their influence. So it was more of an influence operation.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that because discussions of Qatar's influence campaign go back only to the 2017 Gulf crisis, and the past before that seems to not be mentioned at all, as if Qatar or its influence campaigns did not exist prior to the events of 2017 and onwards. But it sounds like their operations have been set up for at least a decade beforehand, and of course, they may have peaked with additional funding later, but they had been building ground for some time in Washington.
Right. I mean, Qatar started after 9/11, building ties with people like Indyk and former Democratic Party, State Department officials, academics, and so forth. And and Brookings, received lots of funding from Qatar, and became a, mouthpiece for the Emirate and DC. So this had been going on for at least a decade before the Arab Spring. I don't know that the UAE or Saudi Arabia had worked on such an extent at building their influence in Washington. So it's kind of like, I think it was Yogi Berra said half of winning the game is showing up. Well, the Qatar showed up before everybody else did.
Mhm. And that may explain why its role in supporting Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden was covered up so successfully, whereas all the focus went to Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that it's obvious that funding from the top matters a lot more than 15 random extremists that are recruited to blow up buildings, like low level players versus high level actors.
Well, you talk about Sheikh Haradawi, who sanctioned suicide bombings and virulent anti-Semitism. He spoke at least two of these Doha events where that were sponsored by Brookings. So they were kind of looked the other way. I don't know. I mean, the only thing I can think of is this anti-colonial, postmodern, viewpoint that the West is evil, the West is the aggressor, and that the Arabs or the Muslims are victims, which is something that the far left, the people we call woke today, and the Islamists share in common.
As the Arab Spring raged on and the Obama administration quickly became aware of the violent turn that militias backed by these groups have taken on, clearly it refuted the premise that the Muslim Brotherhood ideologues who followed the so-called political path would moderate and steer the countries away from jihadist activity. Quite the contrary, the situation on the ground deteriorated. Yet, the Obama administration never once um, never once moved away from its position in supporting the Brotherhood or legitimizing them or associating closely with their front organization in the West. They never disputed the fact that their claims of the so-called moderate Muslim Brotherhood simply did not live up to reality. How? Why is that?
Well, it was a matter of the liberal factions were divided among themselves. I spoke with Robert Ford, who was Obama's ambassador to Syria, and he told me that they couldn't agree, who was in charge, who was the official opposition, and he had a meeting in Cairo with them where he and his staff had to physically separate them. So the Brotherhood was, and the Islamists were the only people who were organized. So because the other groups couldn't get their act together, the Obama administration, in some areas, went to them by default. I heard the same thing from an Egyptian activist who dealt with the U.S. ambassador in Egypt at the time, I believe Ann Patterson. And they went to them because there wasn't anyone who was a unified voice who could be a viable alternative to the Islamists. So they stuck with the only group that they quote unquote thought had the perception of popular support.
Some of this sounds like it may have been a self-fulfilling prophecy because Anne Patterson, following these events, became the U.S. ambassador to Qatar. Then she became the head of the Qatar U.S. Business Council, and in general, it seems that her proclivities all seem to point in the same direction. So the question is, was it really that the other factions were so disorganized? Was it that the administration never invested the time to try to help them and was already kind of married to the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood for whatever reason?
Well, I think that you're onto something. I think that they had been under the spell of Qatar for some time at that point, and they kind of had their mind made up. I mean, I spoke with liberal opposition figures from Libya and Syria. They said that when they found out that they weren't Islamists, they couldn't get meetings anymore. A guy by the name of Monem El Yasser, who was a Libyan opposition figure who worked with Islam Mesh and other Brotherhood linked people here in the United States, said that he had access all the way to Obama. When they found out that he was a liberal and that he wasn't an Islamist, they shut the door on him. So, by the Obama administration, for whatever reason, was firmly married to the idea of pushing the Islamists. I mean, the same thing happened in Syria until they realized that the Free Syrian Army wasn't going anywhere. They decided to back the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was the alliance between the Kurds and Christians.
But at the same time, as the Obama administration claimed to be supporting Kurds, they actually um, ended up adopting a position that further divided the Kurds and exacerbated tensions between the different factions and political positions there. So at this point, one it begs the question: was the administration really so ignorant and ideologically blind, or was it that they were pursuing a particular agenda and liberalism simply was not what they wanted to see in place?
Well, I don't think that they sort of knew what they were trying to accomplish because they didn't seem to have any sort of coherent strategy other than listening to whatever the Islamists told them and just going down the primrose path. I mean, look at a guy by the name of Colonel Abdul Jabbar El Akidi, who the Syrian American Council, which is a front group for the Syrian Brotherhood, according to member of the executive committee. I mean, he was sold in Washington as a moderate. But if you look at what he said in Arabic, he was supportive of Al Qaeda, he was supportive of ISIS, and so forth. And he was brought to Washington and paraded, with the think tanks. And they also and then in 2015, the Obama administration met with a guy by the name of Labib Nahas, who was the spokesperson for Arar al-Sham, which is the Syrian Taliban. So they were, for whatever reason, dead set on supporting the Islamists over the liberals.
So the interesting point is that the commentators on the Obama administration often like to underscore the differences between Hillary Clinton and Obama, the fact that they were at odds on a lot of the foreign policy. Hillary was considered more pragmatic and moderate, although she is known for being corrupt, for taking money for her pay for play and so forth, whereas Obama is considered to be more ideological. But the result, as we see, is exactly the same. Despite whatever differences they may have had, it seems that they were, for different reasons perhaps, on the same page when it came to the Brotherhood, Qatar, and so forth, and the resulting wars. How do you explain that?
Well, it's just sort of like, at least on the left, there seems to be different strategies of getting to the same place. I mean, they seem to argue more about tactics and strategies than they do over substance. And one of the first things that Hillary did after becoming Secretary of State was to give Tariq Ramadan, who was a Muslim Brotherhood intellectual from Switzerland, a visa to enter the United States, which had been denied by the Bush administration. So, that shows right off the bat a very different approach. And they canceled the ban on Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, who had been banned by the Clinton administration due to his support for terrorism both in Tunisia and against Israel. So you saw very early, even before the Arab Spring, a change in orientation toward being pro-Islamist. I mean, another thing that you had was George Soros created this consortium that brought these Islamists, led by Muslim advocates leader Farhan Akara, that he underwrote to influence the Obama administration to change the policies on educating military and Homeland Security and the FBI about the links between the Brotherhood and terrorism. So under John Brennan's leadership, they got him to work with Robert Mueller to sanitize the training materials.
So we have this collusion of different interests. Robert Mueller has had a reputation of allowing Islamists into the FBI. Later on, he became infamous for his role in the Russia collusion probe under the Trump administration. This is somebody who had been heavily compromised by these connections, and we're seeing that all of these figures that thrived in these corrupt circles under Obama made a comeback under the Trump administration in their capacity as the opposition heroes and were embraced by Washington, even by some liberal Republicans who were opposed to Trump's figure, which begs the question: if all these people were willing to overlook these unsavory connections, what what how much of Washington was really duped and how much of it was just corruption and willingness to ignore national security concerns for out of financial or political benefit?
Well, I mean, I use the term duped because of the coordinated effort, whether by Qatar, the Brotherhood, and so forth, to influence them into doing things that were contrary to the interests of the country. But I think that, yeah, there is a corrupt sort of collusion and networks that the Islamists were able to use, with Qatar's money and their Brotherhood's organization to take charge. I mean, for I mean, the Brotherhood really was in charge of U.S. Foreign policy under the Obama administration.
So that kind of brings us from the past more towards the following 10 years and into today. We have seen that these connections to the Brotherhood in Qatar never went anywhere, but Qatar also successfully infiltrated the Republican Party through its influence campaigns. How do you explain politically that the same people who were opposed to the Democrats for coddling pro terrorist extremist groups later gave way to financial incentives and came to adopt similar positions?
Well, if you look at John McCain and Lindsey Graham, they were very close to these Qatari interests. And after the Arab Spring, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut met with I'm just trying. We met with a Al Qaeda linked leader in Libya. Then you had John McCain going to Syria with the Syrian Emergency Task Force and Mustafa's group. And Mustafa made several trips to Qatar in the process. And I was told by Robert Ford that John McCain was the single most influential individual on Capitol Hill in terms of pushing the Obama administration, in getting involved in taking these people seriously.
That seems interesting because Lindsey Graham later on claimed to be a huge supporter of Saudi Arabia, and then during the Gulf crisis, completely changed his positions 180 and suddenly became a proponent of Qatar's business investments in South Carolina and seemingly obsessed with the Khashoggi issue. Khashoggi, of course, himself being a Muslim Brotherhood proponent, and a surprising number of Republicans who seemed so concerned about Islamist influence suddenly went deaf and blind when it came to their favorite hero. So these influence campaigns, despite you would have thought that the events of Syria and Libya at that time would have discredited these future efforts, instead they fueled them. And we have seen actually much more of that, and we have seen much less attention to Qatar's role in other military campaigns in Somalia, in Sudan, even following the change in government in Tunisia and so forth. How do we reconcile this obsession with a country that has since those events has become much more clear about its position on funding these organizations? It's now under investigation for funding IRGC. It's been accused of funding Hezbollah. We know that it's openly funding and supporting Hamas. How is it that the more clear Qatar and a Muslim Brotherhood alliance appear to be, the more support and excuses we get from the people that claim that Qatar is somehow indispensable to your security?
Well, I think that their influence operation. I mean, I participated in a talk with their person in their foreign ministry who was in charge of terrorism. They're good at pushing a lot of propaganda about how they're fighting ISIS and so forth. Even though Qataris are been heavily involved in funding ISIS, it's just a real paradox that they have their bought off people in Washington who do their bidding and who seem impervious to questioning. I can't go into details about who this individual is, but I know a terrorism researcher who gets money from Qatar, who says that they're great on dealing with ISIS and so forth, but they don't want to look at other things. So they go in, they butter people up, they give them money, and then they don't go digging and looking at other places. It just is something that is very confusing. But when you're getting money you do what your paymaster tells you to do.
Do you think they still have a lot of influence in the US intelligence community?
Of course. I mean, the Central Intelligence Agency was involved in whitewashing the Brotherhood. I mean, don't forget what James Clapper said, that the Muslim Brotherhood was a largely secular organization. I mean, or John Brennan's stance, but in favor of the Islamists. I mean, they had to train and equip. I mean, like Mr. Muaz Mustafa, went to Capitol Hill, went to U.S. Special Operations Command and MacDill Air Force Base on numerous occasions, and you had the train and equip program come out as a result of it. So these people, were pushing their agenda, and they used the Islamophobia ruse. I mean, the whole thing that if you're against us, it's because you're a bigot, you're a hater, you're an Islamophobe. No one wanted to be called an Islamophobe. It's like, who wants to be called a racist? So you have the carrot and the stick.
So we have the situation. On the one hand, we have once again a highly ideological administration, many of whose people were former Obama foreign policy and national security apparatchiks, and who are already kind of uh, have a tunnel vision on these issues. On the other hand, we have elements of US intelligence that had been trained by Islamists on Islam related issues, that has had embedded veterans of the Obama administration era who had been pushing these relationships. And when they provide analysis that is already imbued with these ideas to the administration, it only reinforces rather than challenges existing policies. How do we prevent this? What's the way to break through this circular um, path, this self-perpetuating cycle of
Well,
reinforcing failed ideas?
the first thing the Republicans need to do is make civil service reform front and center. And they need to bring back veterans from the intelligence community who can be trusted to go through after they change the civil service reforms to make it easier to fire people, so that you can look at people who had been embedded under Obama, then under Clinton, and who had been embedded under this current administration, assuming a Republican administration takes over in 2025, to clean house, because our intelligence community has become a liability. I mean, they fail to predict the collapse of Afghanistan the way that it did. They failed time and time again.
That brings us again to the events of today. We are seeing several things happen. First of all, the Trump administration engaged in these Doha talks, which continued through Biden, who could have challenged the decisions of the previous administrations but did not. He went along with that policy and made it even more disastrous than it could have been. But it wasn't a good idea to begin with. You had Qatar for selling a fictional image of a moderate Taliban, not something that someone like Mike Pompeo could possibly believe in good faith. I can't imagine someone like him falling for such a completely naive and misguided, delusional idea. You had two administrations giving credence to Qatar's role in 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 giving a fictitious cover for U.S. withdrawal, entirely self-serving and with no framework to replace it in a way that would bring any sort of stability. How do you explain that they chose to go about withdrawing in that way, relying on an unreliable partner instead of thinking of some other framework that, or engaging with somebody else, with some other actor that may have provided better guidance in this situation. Was
Well,
it corruption? Was it name that? Was it what was it?
my understanding is that from reliable sources with connections to the administration, the prior administration, that Jared Kushner had strong business ties with Qatar, and I think that the president had some too. So maybe they trusted them because they thought they could be reliable in business, that they could be reliable in diplomacy, and also because of Qatar's leverage over the Taliban. So I mean that's just sort of a theory that I have there, but I can't prove or verify anything. But anybody who looks close enough at what Qatar is doing, you can't look at anything other than as a nefarious power.
So we are being constantly fed this delusion that Qatar is indispensable, that Qatar is an ally despite funding numerous terrorist organizations as it claims to be fighting terrorism. It continues spreading radical ideas inside the United States. As an ally, it continues to meddle in US policy, subvert democratic institutions, create its own fifth columnists in political and academic circles. That is not an action of a friendly state. That's an action of a subversive power seeking to undermine U.S. institutions and U.S. policy towards its own goals and against other U.S. allies in the region. And yet its power grows as time goes on, and more institutions fall under its influence. And we are seeing how much do you think of an impact Qatar currently has on US policy? We are seeing the normalization of Assad and at the same time complete lack of action on the militias and other violent groups on the ground in Syria. We are seeing questionable policy on Libyan elections that are coming up. We are seeing the Muslim Brotherhood institutions continuing to proliferate in the US. Jake Sullivan, as you mentioned, had warned Hillary Clinton about Muslim Brotherhood's ties with the Al Qaeda, but now we hear only silence from him on this issue. What is going on?
Well, what's going on is that they've just bought into the narrative that the Brotherhood is quote unquote democratic, or that these people were freedom fighters, against Western oppression, or whichever. But they've it all comes back to money. The thing is that Qatar has been strategic in the influencers that it's chosen to buy off. I mean, it's been, maybe only China has been more successful in terms of, taking, control of the elite classes here in the United States. Qatar has groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations. It has, different Islamist groups in the United States that lobby on behalf of its interests.
In that sense, the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, as President Bush dubbed this decision to oppose jihadism, if you will, it has been a complete failure. Um, it 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 was a misnomer. It helped to recruit terrorists. There was no attempt to push back against extremist ideas. Islamism, as such, was not even considered a separate threat, and even still, it's somewhat of a taboo topic in policy circles. How do we reconcile the US constant refrain of commitment to fight against terrorism and extremism to the fact that it's funding, backing terrorists, extremists, violent and subversive groups, both domestically and all over the world?
Well, you really can't. I mean, if you really want to look at it, The Central Intelligence Agency was involved in supporting Islamist groups like the Brotherhood going back to the 1950s when they were seen as a foil against the pro-Soviet, pan-Arabist movement. And then go to Afghanistan, where the CIA provided funding via Saudi Arabia, the ISI, UAE, etc., to the Mujahideen. So there's been a sort of looking the other way about these groups for a very long time, and I don't think there's any sort of coherent, logical way of doing it. We should have put more emphasis on soft power in terms of like education and opportunity in these countries. I mean, going to war in Iraq, for example, ended up becoming a major magnet for jihadists and for jihadist recruitment, along with the decision to support Karzai in Afghanistan, which gave the Taliban a route back into power. So we basically shown a complete ignorance, a lack of understanding of the people we're dealing with, and they've been able to be bought off by Qatar and other nefarious powers.
So I'm curious about this. Following the Alula agreement between the GCC states, it became essentially taboo to criticize Qatar for anything in public, even though that wasn't part of the agreement. The agreement wasn't that you can't criticize the country. The agreement was that they would reconcile politically, financially, and so forth, and continue their relations. But essentially, it became taboo to name Qatar as being behind anything, whereas Qatar continues its campaigns against other states. Um, and I am curious, what effect does it have when you can't acknowledge the source of funding for the Muslim Brotherhood? UAE, for instance, has made it a point of obsession to to address Islamist threats all over the world. Egypt is taking tough measures against Muslim Brotherhood's institutions and ideas, not just arrests of particular operatives inside the country. How are any of these countries planning to succeed when they cannot mention Qatar, and how is U.S. planning to succeed in de-radicalizing anybody when this country, a major source of funding for these groups, is constantly being praised as a counter-terrorism partner? I mean, this is almost a, an incident of the emperor's new clothes that we have here, where no one dares to say that the emperor, in fact, has none.
Well, it's laughable. I mean, it just shows that. I mean, the Qataris have their network of think tanks and influence operations throughout the Western world that have on one side pushed the Islamophobia narrative, so that people aren't looking into what Qatar is doing, what the Muslim Brotherhood is doing, because they don't want to be called bigots, they don't want to be called Islamophobes, and so forth. You're right. The so-called war on terror was lost a long time ago when we decided to look at the Muslim Brotherhood as a partner and as a firewall against hardcore jihadism, while ignoring the fact that Al Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood, while they differ in public about their strategies and their tactics, are all too happy to work together behind closed doors and to share funding. I mean, the Brotherhood has been a major source of funding for Al Qaeda over the years through its NGOs and through its charities and so forth. So it's just really laughable. I don't know what the plan is, because right now it looks like the Biden administration is just Obama 3.0. And, I think that it needs to be a lot of education of people who might go into the next administration, and hopefully it's a Republican administration, on who these people are, what their goals are, and developing a long-term strategy for putting them back into check and making them persona non grata. I mean, starting with lobbying reform and with a ban on foreign contributions and involvement in American think tanks.
One interesting thing is that under the Trump administration, RGC was designated as a terrorist organization, but Muslim Brotherhood was not, despite its being designated that way in a number of Muslim countries. Do you think this is something that, and in fact, Trump was dissuaded from that by the State Department and Pentagon officials and so forth. Do you think this is something, this idea, which has been proposed by Senator Cruz and a few other supporters, is that something realistic? Can it ever happen? Do you think it should? And if not, what are the alternatives?
Well, I think the problem is it's with the definition of terrorism under U.S. law. I mean, it's you can go after Hezbollah because there's no distinction between the political and the military wings of Hezbollah. But the thing is, the connection among the brotherhood groups, there isn't a single Muslim brotherhood in the United States. You have a network of related organizations. They're united more by ideological and historical connections than you do as a coherent organization. I mean, like take Hamas, where you can show that the military wing and the political wing are one and the same. So, under U.S. law is what makes it very difficult to designate the brotherhood. You could probably use something more like RICO, racketeer influenced corrupt organizations, to treat the brotherhood more like a mafia in the United States, and which would make them treat them more in the vein of organized crime, because that's what satisfied U.S. law. I mean, you have First Amendment rights. I mean, you can disagree with groups like CARE and so forth, but unless you can prove that they're giving money to support terrorism directly, it's kind of hard to make the case. But the way that you do it, I think, is more of a RICO route.
That's a really good point that I myself has have considered in the past. Have in fact suggested to people, and I've been going back and forth on whether that should be whether it's more doable or at least more likely to yield some sort of accountability, if not ideologically satisfying, as in the idea of terrorism and uh, holding them accountable for contributing to violent and subversive movements and operations. But in some sense, it's almost like fighting Hydra or other,
Yes.
comic book fictional networks that uh,
Well,
seem
that's
to
why
be.
RICO was developed, in the early '70s to take down the Italian mafia, because it operated like a hydra. It was hard to build your case to go and get the Dons for subverting like the Teamsters Union and other corrupt organizations. I mean, the way that you deal with it, I mean. Paul Sperry and David Galbats were right when they called it the Muslim Mafia,
Hmm.
because it's a mafia that uses religion as its defining characteristic, as opposed to ethnicity, as was the case with the Low Costa Nostra, the Russian Mafia, the the triads from Southeast Asia, etc.
When you were researching the book and you brought up your interest in confronting these corrupt relationships. What kind of pushback did you receive, if any?
Oh, I haven't gotten any. I mean, the
So
thing
people were
is
pretty
that
open.
yeah, everybody's been pretty open. The thing is that after I went and looked into these guys for 8 years when I was working for the Investigative Project on Terrorism, they never called me a bigot even once. because I always had my facts. I always dotted my T's and not dotted my T's, crossed my T's and dotted my I's to make sure that I had my facts right. I mean, if I went after the mayor of Prospect Park, New Jersey, uh, for working with Jabhat al-Nusra, Al Qaeda in Syria, I made sure that I had documentation from his social media that was corroborated by multiple sources. I always make sure that I have more than one source for each piece of information before I go out and put it out. So it's kind of hard for them to come after me and describe me as a bigot or a hater or whichever when I'm just using their information. I mean, CARE fired its Islamophobia director, Abbas Barzagar, after I proved that he had been involved with Turkey's IHH, which supports Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations based on his social media.
So there is a possibility of holding these people accountable. It's just that for whatever reason, the people who claim to be at the forefront of this are just not doing the right things. How to explain that they haven't figured out that the way to go after them is through rational, fact based kind of investigative efforts rather than through very shallow media campaigns that are easily discredited.
Well, it's like, how do we change the educational system? I mean, it's a very thorny, very difficult thing. It's all about policy is people. So you have to get the right people into these positions, into the U.S. attorney's offices, and so forth in the next administration, who are going to carry out the instructions of the President of the United States and his Attorney General, instead of working to subvert like we had in the last administration. I mean, things didn't get done because he left too many Obama holdovers in place.
Hmm.
I mean, like if you look in
So that.
Syria,
Hmm.
yeah, like if you look in Syria, uh, you had people who had been part of Obama's State Department who were actively coordinating with these same Muslim Brotherhood groups that were based in Turkey. So personnel is policy.
So I'm glad to hear all of this because it makes me hopeful that there is at least a possibility of solution if only we can get the right people to the top. And I think that's one takeaway from a rather dismal historic picture that is now unfortunately has shaped the present and is helping shape the future at least for the next few years thanks to the continuity of failed ideas that have never really been fully publicly discredited in a convincing way. And your work helps build that foundation for finally refuting these ideas in a credible manner. So that great job on that. And again, I hope everyone who's been listening to this gets a chance to read John's book right here, and and think about these ideas. It's time to kind of start thinking not as well. It's too big. There's too much. We can't do anything. And then about informed people can counter even very powerful networks when they act in, in an organized way, when they share ideas, when when they're willing to stand up to failures, to policy failures, to personnel failures, to failed ideas. Thank you, John. And this has been once again the Washington Outside report on the coalition radio. Thank you to everyone who's been listening, and I hope to see you all again next week.
Thank you, Irina.